He watched from a distance as his son sat with a homeless alien girl on a park bench. But what he heard made his blood run cold. She was teaching advanced physics equations with flawless precision. "The gravitational constant comes first," she explained, her voice carrying across the quiet space. In that moment, Jonathan Mercer knew this was no chance encounter. This girl's intellect defied her circumstances, and his son's future was about to change forever. Jonathan Mercer moved through the manicured paths of Elysium Central Park, the soft crunch of imported earth gravel under his polished leather shoes. This daily walk was his one ritual of silence between briefings and state functions, a diplomat's small luxury. But today the rhythm broke. There, on a sun-bleached public bench, sat his son Michael. Not with academy classmates or their polished alien peers. A girl with dirt-smudged cheeks and worn-out shoes sat beside him, her alien features sharp under the midday light. Her hands moved as she spoke, fingers tracing invisible shapes in the air. Jonathan expected to hear the easy chatter of children. Instead, the breeze carried crisp technical terms: orbital velocity, gravitational constants. She was explaining propulsion mathematics to his 10-year-old. Michael nodded, brow furrowed, trying to keep up. He scribbled a calculation on his datapad, then hesitated. She leaned forward. "No, watch the exponent," she said, her voice low but clear. "You dropped the square." She took the stylus from his hand and corrected the formula with a swift, unshaking line. Her confidence was absolute, unnerving in someone who looked like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Michael stared, his expression shifting from confusion to awe. Then she said something that made Jonathan's breath catch. Michael had asked about her home. She shrugged one thin shoulder. "People misunderstand the Eastern District," she answered, her tone factual, not bitter. "They see only what's missing, not what's there." The words hung between them. Too knowing, too weary for a child. Jonathan stood frozen, a man who negotiated with star system governors, now completely disarmed by a small girl in patched clothing. Her intellect was a bright, sharp light in a place everyone else called dark. The disparity between what she was and where she came from didn't make sense. It clawed at the edges of everything he'd accepted about this city, this world. This wasn't an accident. It was a signal, a moment of contact. He felt it like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. His diplomatic instincts, usually reserved for treaty rooms and secure channels, kicked into motion. He was looking at a key, not to a person, but to a people, to a part of Elysium he'd been taught to pity or ignore, but never to see. His privileged blindness cracked open. In the shadows of the gleaming capital, intelligence wasn't just surviving. It was teaching physics on a park bench, using terms his own son struggled to grasp. What made a wealthy diplomat stop and really look? He saw potential where his government saw a problem. He saw a mind where others saw a migrant. And he knew, with a clarity that felt like fate, that this equation was only the beginning. Jonathan extended the dinner invitation with the practiced grace of a diplomat. He chose his words like chess moves, emphasizing cultural exchange and mutual interest in education. He never mentioned the bench, never mentioned the physics. He framed it as a simple gesture between parents. But beneath the polished language, real concern tightened his throat. The Nathal family lived in a Section 8 housing block on the Eastern District's edge. The lift groaned on its way up. The hall lights flickered. When the door slid open, the air that met him was thick and layered. Damp concrete, boiled grains, and underneath it all the sharp, sterile scent of medicine. The apartment was one room divided by a worn curtain. A small cooking unit hummed in the corner. A single window looked out onto another grim tower. Siri sat on a low stool by a sleeping mat, her datapad open on her knees. Her mother, Sifia Nathal, stood by the sink. Her posture was rigid, her eyes guarded. She did not smile when Jonathan repeated his invitation. He mentioned he had resources, connections, that he might be able to help. Sifia's hand stilled on the dish she was cleaning. She looked from Jonathan's fine clothes to her daughter's mended sleeves. "Help comes with strings, Ambassador," she said, her voice flat. "We know that kind of help," Jonathan insisted. He spoke of Siri's clear talent, her potential. The words seemed to break something in Sifia. She leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping. "Potential," she repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Her potential is dying, just like her father's did." She told him about Cascade Syndrome, a degenerative condition unique to her species, attacking the neural pathways. It was slow. It was cruel. It had taken her husband, a theoretical physicist whose work was once celebrated. Now it was claiming her. The tremors in her hands were not from fatigue. The medicine was a stopgap, a financial drain that was drowning them. "We are brilliant, Ambassador," she said, no pride in the statement. "And we are bankrupt because of it." Then she spoke of debt. Not financial, but cultural. A deep-seated Alaean belief that accepting significant aid created an unbreakable obligation, a bond of service that could span generations. To her, Jonathan's offer was a velvet-lined trap. The cure might be worse than the disease. "You would own us," she whispered. "That is the price. We would owe you everything." He left their apartment with the smell of medicine clinging to his clothes. That night, from his spacious quarters overlooking the city's glittering core, he acted. He anonymously cleared their housing arrears. He secured and prepaid a full diagnostic session with a top specialist in xenomedicine. It was a direct violation of the unwritten rules. A rebellion against a system that let genius wither in the dark. The background check he ordered confirmed it all. Sylvia Nathal was a leading biochemist before her illness. Her late husband's papers on quantum field theory were still cited. Series test scores, smuggled from district archives, were off the charts. They were a family of staggering intellect, trapped by biology and prejudice. This was not charity. It was a strategic extraction, a rescue mission for national treasures everyone else had forgotten. What did Jonathan discover about Siri's family that changed everything? He found a legacy of brilliance being extinguished by neglect. The debt he paid was not just for rent, but for a future. He wasn't just saving a mother and daughter. He was salvaging a national resource. He was buying back the time they were losing, one anonymous credit transfer at a time. Siphia's sister, Sophia Nathal, arrived 2 days later. She did not knock. She simply appeared at the door of Jonathan's embassy residence, her posture a straight, defiant line against the polished marble lobby. Jonathan had expected a quieter version of Sophia, perhaps timid or worn down. Sophia was the opposite. Her gaze was a laser, calm and calculating. She did not thank him. She assessed him from the polished toes of his shoes to the art on his walls, measuring his power, his influence, his utility. She accepted a glass of water but did not drink. "My sister calls you a benefactor," she stated, her voice low and even. "I am less sentimental. Benefaction implies a gift. Gifts can be taken back. We require something more lasting." Jonathan began to explain his intentions again, the speech about helping a brilliant child. Sophia cut him off with a slight raise of her hand. "We do not need your charity, Ambassador. We need an alliance." The word landed between them, solid and heavy. It reframed his pity into strategy, his compassion into a contract. The air in the room grew taut. This was no longer about saving a family. It was a negotiation. On the table was her family's formidable overlooked intellect. In return, she wanted his political capital, his earthly authority. It was a trade. "Their minds for his influence. I know this city," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Not the city you see from your towers. I know its alleys, its whispers, the officials who can be persuaded, the ones who cannot. You are an outsider playing a game you do not yet understand. You will fail without a guide." She offered him a map, not on paper but in her knowledge. She knew the intricate, unwritten rules of Alaean caste and custom. She knew which doors were locked and which only appeared to be. She could navigate the treacherous currents of local politics that had already begun to pull him under. Her value was not just her niece's genius. It was her own ruthless understanding of the machine he was trying to fight. Jonathan's personal mission evaporated. It was replaced by a joint venture, a shared and dangerous gamble. He was no longer a savior. He was a partner. The risks were higher now. Failure would not just disappoint him. It would bury them all. He extended his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, her skin cool. There were no signed documents, no witnesses. The agreement was sealed in that silent handshake, a fusion of Earth's resources and the Eastern District's hardened resilience. It was the first brick placed in a bridge meant to span a chasm of deep-seated prejudice and unearned privilege. How did a dinner invitation turn into a cross-cultural alliance? It turned when one woman saw past the offer of help and proposed a deal instead. They weren't just saving a family from illness and poverty. They were building a foundation for something entirely new, a partnership that would challenge the very structure of their world. The restaurant was called Aura, a place of suspended glass platforms and soft light. Each table cost more than a month's rent in the Eastern District. Ambassador Trelovic chose it deliberately. He smiled as Jonathan sat, a perfect, practiced expression that didn't touch his cold eyes. His son Vexner sat beside him, a younger, sharper copy watching everything with a predator's stillness. The meal arrived. Delicate, intricate dishes. Trelovic didn't touch his food. He leaned forward, his voice a confidential murmur. "We've noticed your recent project, Jonathan," he began. "A certain family from the Eastern Quarter. A charitable impulse, no doubt. Admirable in its way." He said charitable like it was a dirty word. Jonathan kept his face neutral. "I see it as an investment in untapped potential." Trelovic's smile tightened at the edges. "Potential is a dangerous thing to unleash without consideration. This city, our alliance, it functions on balance, a careful equilibrium. You are placing a weight on one side of the scale. You cannot be surprised when it tilts." He was no longer talking about one girl. He was talking about a system, a way of life. "The Eastern District has its place," Trelovic continued, his tone smooth and deadly. "Its people have their roles. To elevate one is to suggest the structure itself is flawed. It creates expectations, discontent, it destabilizes everything." Jonathan felt the trap close around him. This wasn't a discussion. It was a warning. "Talent isn't confined to a postal code, Trelovic," he said, his own voice hardening. "It exists everywhere. Ignoring it is a waste, a strategic error." The air in the luxurious room went cold. The words hung between them, simple and undeniable. Trelovic's smile vanished. He looked at Jonathan not as a colleague, but as a problem. "Is that the official position of Earth? To lecture us on our own social order?" He leaned back, a pity. "We had such productive relations." Vexner, silent until now, let his gaze drift over Jonathan. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He was a living lesson in his father's ideology. Privilege wasn't just his birthright. It was his identity, and he would defend it. The lunch was over. The civility had been a veneer, and now it was cracked. Jonathan walked out of Aura knowing the rules had changed. His quiet support for the Nathals was now a public point of conflict. The ambassador's polite skepticism was a declaration. The fight was no longer just about helping a family. It was a challenge to the established order, and the order was going to push back hard. Why did Earth's allies turn against Jonathan's integration program? They didn't see a gifted child. They saw a threat to the natural order. They saw a challenge to the quiet, comfortable power they had held for generations. In a universe of advanced science and star travel, their greatest fear was a change in the social hierarchy. They saw opportunity not as a gift to be given, but as a threat to their control. And they would fight to stop it. The Elysium Prime Academy was a palace of polished floors and silent, sweeping arches. Its air hummed with filtered perfection, a stark contrast to the damp corridors Siri knew. On her first day, every student turned. They did not stare with curiosity. They assessed. Their eyes cataloged the slight wear on her uniform's hem, the way she carried her second-hand datapad. Here, heritage was your only credit. Her Eastern District origin was a brand, and everyone could read it. Vexner led the charge. He never shouted. He didn't have to. His voice was a low, cutting instrument for his friends alone. "District air must be thinner," he'd murmur as she passed. "Explains the stunted growth." His clique would smile, a wall of cool, shared amusement. They orchestrated her exclusion with precision. A seat would be saved just as she approached. A study group would dissolve the moment she showed interest. It was a war of subtle gestures and quiet words, designed to make her feel her place was not here. Michael watched this. For a week he said nothing, caught between the world he was born into and the truth he now saw. The breaking point was a physics tutorial. The instructor posed a complex orbital mechanics problem. Silence. Then Siri's hand went up. She offered a solution, her explanation clear and flawless. The instructor nodded, impressed. Vexnor's face tightened. After class, Vexnor blocked her path. "You think a few clever tricks change what you are?" he said, his voice dropping so only their small group could hear. "You're a charity case. A pet project. Don't forget it." Michael stepped between them. "Leave her alone, Vex. The words were simple. The act was monumental. The hallway went quiet. In defending her, Michael had crossed a line. He had chosen an outsider over his own. The betrayal was written on every face. He was no longer one of them. He was a traitor by association, and the rules of engagement now included him. The classroom lost its purpose. Answers were no longer just right or wrong. When Siri spoke, her knowledge was met with rolled eyes or exaggerated sighs. Her intelligence wasn't celebrated. It was a social violation. It proved she didn't know her role. Her calm, logical corrections in discussion groups only made them hate her more. Her mind was the weapon they truly feared, because it was the one thing their status couldn't buy or control. The library became their only refuge. Its vast, silent shelves held no opinions. Here, knowledge was just knowledge. Siri and Michael would claim a table in a distant corner, surrounded by the scent of old books and data crystals. For a few hours, the social battlefield faded. They could just be two students working. The value was in the information, not the name attached to it. This quiet war of whispers and exclusion was the academy in miniature. It mirrored the larger political fight happening in government chambers and embassy halls. The weapons were different. Cruel nicknames instead of legislation, cold shoulders instead of economic sanctions. But the goal was the same: to maintain a hierarchy. To keep people in their assigned places. Why did the academy's elite students target Michael and Siri? Because their friendship was a living, breathing challenge. It was proof that the system was a choice, not a natural law. They were a danger to a world built entirely on the power of a name, a title, an inherited right. By simply existing together, they threatened to rewrite the rules everyone else had agreed to play by. The rooftop garden was their secret place, a green ledge high above the city's noise. Up there, the academy's whispers and judging looks couldn't reach. The air was clean. Alien constellations hung in the sky like scattered silver dust, close enough to touch. It was the one spot where they could breathe. Siri was quiet that evening. She sat with her knees drawn up, watching the lights of the Eastern District flicker miles below. Michael sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The silence between them was comfortable but heavy with something unspoken. "There's something I haven't told you," she said finally. Her voice was low, almost lost in the hum of the city. She wasn't looking at him. "It's about my people, about how we bond." He turned to her.
"What do you mean?"
She took a slow breath, as if choosing her words from a dangerous selection. "For us, a connection, a real one. It isn't just a feeling. It's not just in our hearts." She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her pants. "It's in our bodies. It's physiological. A biology of belonging." The words hung between them, strange and impossible. Michael frowned, trying to understand. "What does that mean?" "It means when we find someone." She paused, her gaze finally meeting his. "When the connection is true and deep, it manifests. It shows. Shows how?" he asked, his own voice barely a whisper now. Without another word, she reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool against his. For a second, nothing happened. Then he saw it. A soft, ethereal light began to emanate from beneath her skin where their fingers touched. It was a gentle, rhythmic pulse, a subtle glow that seemed to breathe. It traveled up her wrist, a visible current of connection. He stared, his own breath catching in his throat. It was beautiful and utterly alien. It was proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that what was between them was more than a shared love of physics or a defense against bullies. It was a fundamental resonance, a harmony written into their very cells. This wasn't a choice. It wasn't a crush. It was a fact of their existence, as real as the stars above them. The light was a silent language, speaking of a bond that ignored species, culture, and the vast social chasm that separated their worlds. It was a biological imperative, a truth that could not be argued with or hidden. In that soft, pulsating glow, everything changed. Their relationship was instantly transformed from a teenage connection into something ancient, something inevitable. The world downstairs, with all its rules and prejudices, suddenly felt small and fragile. They were living evidence of a deeper truth, a connection that was not merely emotional but elemental. It was written not in promises or words, but in the light that glowed where their skin met. Vexnor found them in the main courtyard, surrounded by polished stone and the watchful eyes of the Academy's security sensors. He didn't shout. He walked up with his usual lazy confidence, his small group of loyal followers falling in behind him like a shadow. He stopped a few feet from Michael, ignoring Siri completely as if she were a piece of furniture. "Still following your little district rat around, Mercer?" he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Does she do tricks for you? Fetch your data pad? Recite equations to make you feel smart?" His friend snickered. The words were sharp, practiced. They were meant to humiliate Michael, to make him deny her or step away to save his own social standing. They were designed to draw blood without leaving a mark, to force a public choice that would break their alliance. Michael's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He just stood his ground. This seemed to infuriate Vexner more than any retort. The casual insult wasn't working. He needed to escalate. His gaze finally flicked to Siri, a look of pure contempt. "Move," he said to her, his tone flat and commanding. He took a step forward as if to simply walk through the space she occupied. When she didn't instantly comply, his hand shot out. He shoved her shoulder hard. It was a sudden, violent motion, a physical violation of the one unspoken rule that had until now kept their conflict in the realm of words and glares. Siri stumbled back, catching herself against a stone bench. The sound of her palm slapping the cold rock echoed in the sudden quiet. The tension didn't just snap. It detonated. Michael's reaction was pure, unfiltered instinct. There was no thought, no calculation of political consequences. There was only the sight of Vexner's hands on her. His fist connected with Vexner's jaw with a solid, ugly crack. Vexner went down. He hit the polished courtyard stone with a heavy thud, followed by a sharp groan of pain and surprise. The sound seemed to suck all the noise from the world. The laughter died. The conversations in the courtyard froze. For 3 full seconds there was only silence, broken by the ragged sound of Vexner's breathing and the collective gasp of 24 students. This was no schoolyard scuffle. It was an event. Every move, every word, every impact had been captured by the discreet security feeds mounted in the arches above. It was all on record. A human diplomat's son had just assaulted the son of a senior Alayan ambassador. It was an interstellar incident waiting to be filed. The disciplinary committee hearing was a cold, formal affair. The headmaster read the report in a monotone. The committee members, all prominent citizens with ties to families like the Trelovics, listened with stone faces. They showed the security footage. It was damning. They spoke of breach of conduct, of violence, of the need for order. They never mentioned the weeks of taunts. They never mentioned the shove. Michael's punishment was community service. It was a political compromise, a carefully measured slap on the wrist that was meant to satisfy his father's position, while signaling to Trelovic that the status quo was being upheld. It was a warning shot, a message that defiance, even in defense of another, would be punished. The system had flexed its muscle, and the message was clear. Step out of line and there will be a cost. How did a schoolyard fight nearly derail interspecies diplomacy? Because it was never just a fight. It was a physical manifestation of the cultural war being waged in the halls of power. That single punch, thrown in defense of a friend, became an instant symbol. It was a refusal to play by the old rules. It was an act of resistance against a system that demanded silence and compliance, and it very nearly cost them everything. They decided to get married. It wasn't just a romance. It was a masterstroke, a calculated move to turn their private affection into a very public, very durable political shield. They were done playing defense. Jonathan looked at Sophia across his desk, the city light sprawling behind her. "It will make us a target," he said, his voice flat. She met his gaze without blinking. "We already are. Let's make the target mean something." The announcement went out on all official channels. It was brief, formal. It used the correct diplomatic language, but the meaning was a thunderclap. Human ambassador to wed Alayan national. The words were a direct, deliberate challenge to Trelovic's entire narrative of separation. He preached that the species were too different, that mixing was a dilution, a danger. Their engagement was a live rebuttal, playing out in real time. The tension was a high-wire act. Every detail of the planned ceremony was a negotiation, a fusion. They pored over traditions, a human exchange of rings, an alien shared cup of sacred water, a vow in 2 languages. They chose the ancient grove, Elysium's most revered site, as their venue. It was a bold claim. They were taking the most sacred symbols of both cultures and weaving them into something new. They were reclaiming words like partners and bond, No longer terms for business deals or biological quirks. They were making them mean unity, family, a shared future under one roof. Their union was no longer just about two people. It was a living argument. A physical example that two species could build a life, a home. It was proof you could love someone from a different world and not lose yourself. You could gain a whole new one. Trelovich's faction reacted with cold, quiet fury. They didn't send congratulations. They sent thinly veiled threats wrapped in formal complaints. They called the wedding a provocation, a destabilizing spectacle. They didn't see a celebration. They saw a declaration of war, a flag planted on territory they considered theirs. The couple knew this. They knew they were painting a massive target on their own backs. They were making the most private part of their lives a public spectacle on purpose. Their wedding would be the most watched, most scrutinized event on the planet. Every smile, every gesture would be a piece of political ammunition, for or against them. This stopped being about Jonathan and Sophia. It was about the image they presented to millions. It was about showing an alternative reality, a glimpse of a future where the Eastern District wasn't a slum, but a source of strength. Where human and alien wasn't a division, but a partnership. They were building a stage, and they were going to stand on it and show everyone what came next. Why did Jonathan and Sophia's engagement become a political weapon? Because they were tired of arguing against prejudice with policy papers and diplomatic notes. You can debate a policy. You can't debate two people holding hands, looking at each other with real love. They chose to fight not with words, but with proof. A living, breathing, undeniable example that the future Trelovich feared was not only possible, it was already here. They chose to weaponize their own happiness. The Elder Arch stood in the heart of the ancient grove, a monument of weathered silver-etched stone. For generations it had hosted unity ceremonies, its very presence a promise of peace. Jonathan and Sophia chose it for that powerful symbolism, a fact Ambassador Trelovich noted with cold interest. He saw it not as a sacred space, but as the perfect stage for a brutal kind of political theater. His plot was a false flag operation, a classic tool of sabotage designed to deceive. His goal wasn't just disruption. He intended to massacre the hope of unity itself and pin the blame squarely on the Eastern District, discrediting the Human-Elysian Alliance and Jonathan Mercer in one bloody, devastating stroke. The night before the ceremony, the grove was silent, bathed in the soft light of Elysium's twin moons. The tension was a silent clock ticking down to disaster. Michael and Siri moved through the shadows, their steps quiet on the mossy ground. They came on a feeling, a shared sense of wrongness that hummed along the bond they now knew was real. They trusted that connection more than the official security reports that claimed the area was clear. They had to see for themselves. They found the truth hidden beneath the arch itself, concealed in a hollow carved into the ancient roots. It wasn't a simple device. It was a network of packaged high explosives, blocks of a putty-like substance secured with meticulous care. The wiring was complex, a spiderweb of connections leading to a central trigger mechanism. Siri's breath caught. She pointed to the setup. "Dual failsafes," she whispered, her voice tight. A timer and a remote receiver. Two separate ways to ensure the bomb would go off. The technical sophistication was chilling. This was not the work of desperate protesters. This was a professional, calculated act. Then they heard voices. Two figures emerged from the deeper shadows of the grove, walking toward the arch for a final check. They wore the simple, rough-spun clothes of Eastern District laborers, a perfect disguise. Siri's hand moved instantly to a small device on her wrist, a piece of tech she'd cobbled together from district salvage. It was a recorder, disguised as a piece of decorative junk. She activated it with a silent tap. The saboteur's conversation cut through the quiet night. "The explosives are already in place," one said, his tone bored, efficient. "The remote signal is clear. They'll be standing right on top of it when it blows." The other laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Let them have their unity. They'll be united in pieces, and everyone will know it was her people who did it." A beautiful tragedy. The words were not just a plan. They were a confession. This was an attempt to frame an entire community for mass murder. The cold, technical details of the remote detonation scheme highlighted the pure, calculated malice behind it. The choice of location, the disguised operatives, the redundant triggers. Every element was designed for maximum carnage and maximum blame. Michael and Siri held their breath. pressed against the cold stone, listening to the men who planned to kill their parents and hundreds of guests. They were no longer just two teenagers in love. They were holding evidence that could prevent a massacre and expose a top-level conspiracy, or get them killed if they were discovered. The race was on. They had to get this recording to Jonathan before the first guests arrived, before the first note of the ceremony music played. The fate of the Alliance and their families now rested on a file stored on a piece of junk tech, and their ability to escape the grove unseen. What was Trelovik's real plan to sabotage the Unity ceremony? He didn't want to stop it. He wanted to let it happen. To let everyone gather under the arch filled with hope and promise. He wanted to drown that hope in blood and shrapnel, and then point a finger at the very people the ceremony was meant to uplift. He didn't want to cancel the wedding. He wanted to use it as a funeral pyre for the idea of unity itself. They moved through the grove like ghosts, their steps silent on the thick moss. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the distance froze them in place. The shadows beneath the ancient trees felt alive, hiding things. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. This was a silent, dangerous dance, and a single misstep could end it all. Ciri's hand went to her wrist. The device looked like a piece of common debris, a tangle of scavenged wires and scrap metal she'd fashioned into a recorder. It was a product of Eastern District ingenuity, using what others threw away to build something vital. Her knowledge of that underground tech culture was their only real weapon tonight. It was a tool no professional security team would ever think to look for. They pressed themselves against the rough bark of a massive tree. The two saboteurs were walking back toward the arch, their work finished. The men spoke in low, confident tones, proud of their craftsmanship. Ciri aimed the disguised recorder. The tension was a physical weight in the air. They held their breath. "The explosives are already in place," one man said, his voice crisp in the night air. The phrase landed like a death sentence. It was a statement of cold, accomplished fact. "The remote signal is clear. They'll be standing right on top of it when it blows." The other man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Let them have their unity. They'll be united in pieces, and everyone will know it was her people who did it." A beautiful tragedy. The recording was more than just sound. It was a confession. It was the plan laid bare. But hearing the plan and proving who gave the orders were two different battles. They had the voices, the words, the chilling intent. Proving these men answered to Trelovich, that this was a plot from the highest levels of power, that was the next, much harder fight. The recording was the first piece, but the chain of evidence had to be unbreakable. They had to move. Now. Every second they stayed increased the risk of being seen. Discovery meant more than failure. It meant their silence permanently. They knew too much. They had heard the sentence of death for hundreds of people, and that knowledge made them targets. The small device in Ciri's hand felt impossibly heavy. It was no longer just a clever piece of tech. It was the only thing standing between a celebration and a massacre. It was a shield for their parents, for every guest, for the fragile idea of peace itself. The weight of it was terrifying. This covert operation, led by two teenagers hiding in the dark, had just become the most critical diplomatic mission on the planet. The fate of an entire alliance, the prevention of an interstellar incident, the truth of a vicious conspiracy, it all rested on this one piece of evidence, and their ability to get it into the right hands. Before the sun rose on the ceremony, how did Michael and Ciri uncover the explosive plot at the Elder Arch? They didn't storm a fortress or crack a high-security database. They used the enemy's greatest weakness against them, their arrogance. The saboteurs were so sure of their victory, so certain they were unseen and unheard, that they spoke their crime into the quiet night. They gave their confession freely, never imagining that a couple of kids with scavenged tech were listening. Michael and Ciri didn't have to find the evidence. They just had to be quiet enough to let the guilty hang themselves with their own words. The ceremony started. Music swelled. Guests in their finest clothes filled the sacred grove. They smiled. They took their seats. The air hummed with anticipation, a perfect fragile peace. No one looked down. No one suspected the carefully laid explosives hidden beneath the ancient stones of the Elder Arch. Jonathan and Sophia stood waiting for their cue to step forward. They held hands, their grips tight, they knew. Their faces were calm masks. But the tension was a physical thing, a vice clamping down on the space between them. They were about to be married on top of a bomb. The cue came. They walked. Their steps were measured, deliberate. The music changed to a processional hymn. They stopped beneath the arch. The officiant began the ancient words. Every syllable felt weighted. Every second stretched. Sophia's free hand was a fist at her side. Jonathan's eyes scanned the crowd, looking for any sign, any movement. They were actors in a play where the final act could be a fireball. The reveal didn't come with a shout. It came with a crackle, a hiss of static that cut through the hymn, then a voice. It boomed from the public address system, a voice no one expected. It was rough, confident. "The explosives are already in place," the voice said. The music died instantly. "The remote signal is clear. They'll be standing right on top of it when it blows." A second voice laughed. "Let them have their unity. They'll be united in pieces, and everyone will know it was her people who did it." A beautiful tragedy. The recording played out in the sudden dead silence of the grove. The words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. For a moment there was only confusion. Polite faces stared, uncomprehending. Then the meaning hit. The horror dawned. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was followed by a surge of movement, of panic. People stood. Chairs scraped. Security teams in dark uniforms broke from their posts, swarming the base of the arch, their weapons drawn, their movements sharp and urgent. All eyes turned to the ambassador's section. Trelovic was on his feet, his face a pale, furious mask. His leverage, his political capital, his carefully built narrative, it all evaporated in the space of those 30 seconds. His own words, the words of his hired saboteurs, had just incinerated his credibility in front of the entire planetary leadership. He was exposed. The architect of the plot was now its most public victim. The officiant, an elder with a face like weathered stone, watched the chaos. He looked at Jonathan. He looked at Sophia. He saw their clasped hands. He saw their resolve. He raised his voice, a strong, clear sound that cut through the murmuring panic. "We will continue," he declared. The ceremony went on. The vows were exchanged right there, with security teams working frantically below them. It was no longer just a wedding. It was an act of defiance, a testament to a resilience that refused to be terrorized. They would not run. The bomb squad found the device. They disarmed it. The physical threat was neutralized, but the real damage was already done. The blast of truth had already ripped through the assembly. It had shattered alliances and unmasked an enemy. The celebration continued, but it was different. It was quieter, more intense. It was a victory, but a costly one. What happened when the saboteurs were exposed in front of the entire assembly? The unity ceremony transformed. It became a public trial, and the damning evidence was the sound of the guilty men's own voices, confessing their crime to a horrified crowd. They spoke their vows beneath the elder arch. Its ancient silver-etched stones had just survived a bomb. Now they bore witness to something stronger. The words were a mix of Earth tradition and alien promise, spoken in two languages, but they meant the same thing. I do, I will. Forever. Jonathan slipped a band of warm earth gold onto Sophia's finger. She placed a cool, shimmering ring of alien silver onto his. The metals were different. Their touch was cold. But the promise they carried was warm, a tangible covenant. They were more than jewelry. They were a lock. A seal on the deal they had made not just with each other, but with the future. The tension of the day, the fear, the raw adrenaline from the foiled attack, it all melted away. It drained from their shoulders, replaced by a profound and hard-won sense of peace. It was the quiet that comes after a storm. The air itself felt different, lighter. The guests, who had just moments before been frozen in panic, now watched in a silence filled not with fear, but with awe. Michael and Siri stood together just to the side. Their hands were clasped, and between their intertwined fingers a soft, ethereal glow pulsed gently. Their biological resonance, once a secret, was now a visible fact. A soft light in the dimming grove. People saw it. They didn't gasp. They just watched. They understood. This was not a human crush or an alien anomaly. It was a bond. A real physical truth they could all see. This was no longer just a marriage ceremony. It was the birth of a new era. Right there, in front of everyone, the framework for a shared governance and a blended culture was being laid. It was the first brick of a new world, cemented not by law but by love. Two families were now one. A human diplomat and an alien biochemist. A boy from an embassy and a girl from the district. They were irrevocably intertwined, not by accident but by a series of deliberate choices made in the face of crisis. They had chosen each other again and again, and that choice had forged them into a single unit. Jonathan looked at his new wife. He looked at their children standing together, glowing. His mind, usually racing with diplomatic strategy and political calculations, went quiet. A simple human truth filled the space. See a need, help. Find love, cherish it. That was the entire equation. Everything else was just noise. The future was no longer a distant dream discussed in council chambers. It was a reality being built right now, one bond at a time. This wedding. This family. This was the foundation. The work was just beginning, but the direction was set. They were moving forward together. How did one chance encounter in a park reshape the future of two civilizations? It started with a man seeing a girl not for her circumstances but for her mind. It started with a single curious glance across a sunlit park. That glance set off a chain of events built on helping, on loving, on refusing to accept the way things were. It started with a glance and it ended here under the stars with the birth of a new world. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The ceasefire between Earth and Elysium didn't just break. It shattered. That carefully constructed peace, built on decades of cautious negotiation, lay in pieces on the Grove floor. The undeniable proof of Ambassador Trelovik's plot, his own voice ordering a massacre, rendered every previous agreement meaningless. Trust was the first casualty. The second was stability. Trelovik's faction was publicly disgraced, their influence gutted. But a wounded animal is often more dangerous. Stripped of official power and facing public outrage, they retreated into the shadows. Their desperation made them volatile and unpredictable. Their methods would no longer involve polite lunch invitations or veiled threats in fine restaurants. The rulebook had been thrown out. They would fight now with nothing left to lose, and that made them a different kind of threat entirely. Political alliances strained under the new pressure. Old friendships were tested. Long-held grudges, once minor diplomatic inconveniences, were now sharpened and wielded like weapons. The political landscape became a minefield of suspicion. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every offer of help was scrutinized for hidden motives. The tension was a constant smoldering fire, threatening to flare into an open blaze with the slightest misstep. Jonathan Mercer's standing was torn in two. To the reformers and the citizens of the Eastern District, he was a hero. A man who had looked into the heart of their oppression and chosen to fight. But to the old guard, to those who prized the established order above all else, he was a reckless radical. A destabilizing force, a human who had overstepped, meddling in affairs he didn't understand and lighting a fuse that could burn their entire world. His career, once so assured, was now balanced on a knife's edge. His every move was watched, criticized, and judged. The Eastern District Initiative became the focal point of this new conflict. It was no longer just an education program. It was a symbol. To its supporters, it was a heroic effort to correct a historic wrong, a chance to honor talent wherever it was found. To its opponents, it was a dangerous social experiment, a destabilizing force that threatened to upend the natural order and erase centuries of tradition. There was no middle ground. You were for it or you were against it. This polarization forced a choice. Everyone, from the highest diplomat to the lowest street vendor, had to pick a side. You had to define the future you were willing to fight for. The old, comfortable neutrality was a luxury that no longer existed. The path forward was fraught with risk, a narrow ledge over a deep chasm. But the exposure of the truth had slammed the door shut on the past. There was no turning back. Going back meant returning to a world built on a foundation of lies, and that was no longer an option. The resolution of the crisis came at a high cost. The truth, once revealed, was not a clean surgical instrument. It was a bomb. It had blown apart the fragile structures of power and exposed the rot beneath. It brought justice, but it also brought chaos. It forced a painful, necessary reckoning. The new battle lines were not drawn on maps or in treaty documents. They were drawn in the hearts of the people. The real war for the future of Elysium would not be fought with starships or bombs. It would be fought in the choices of its citizens, in their willingness to embrace a harder, truer path. The political ceasefire was over. The fight for the soul of their civilization had just begun. The courtyard fight changed everything. Before, Ciri's genius was her burden. A secret to hide, a reason for shame in a place obsessed with bloodlines over brains. After Michael's punch, it became her vindication. The very thing they mocked was now the only thing that mattered. She was not just the girl from the district. She was the one who understood quantum mechanics when no one else could. She started in a borrowed classroom, a small windowless room usually reserved for storage. Michael was there, of course, but so were others. A handful of students from both sides of the city, all struggling with the same advanced physics curriculum. They came quietly, almost sheepishly, datapads held tight to their chests. The old tension of social prejudice was still there, a low hum in the room. But it was slowly being replaced by a new, sharper tension, the strain of focused thought. The quiet struggle to understand. Her methods were nothing like the Academy's professors. She didn't recite dry theory from ancient texts. Her teaching was born in the Eastern District, a place where you learned by doing because you had to. She used whatever was at hand. A stylus became a particle. A crumpled piece of paper illustrated gravitational curvature. She cut through complex abstract equations with practical physical clarity. She made the impossible feel simple, obvious. These sessions became an open secret. Nobody announced them. Nobody put up flyers. The knowledge just spread through the student body like a quiet current. The room began to fill. A few became a dozen, then 2 dozen. It was a grassroots movement happening right under the Academy's polished nose. A challenge to its rigid structure, not with protests, but with pure, undeniable intellect. Even Vexner's most loyal supporters couldn't ignore it. They would walk past the open door and see her there, explaining a difficult concept to a rapt audience. They saw the nods of understanding, the sudden clarity on frustrated faces. They said nothing. They offered no praise, but they had to look. They were forced into a silent, grudging acknowledgement of her power. Her mind was a weapon they could not defeat with insults or social leverage. She wasn't just teaching them how to solve for velocity or mass. She was teaching them to see. She was showing a generation of the galaxy's future leaders that brilliance was not a product of privilege. It could be found anywhere. In a dusty apartment, on a park bench, in the mind of a girl everyone else had dismissed. She was rewiring their definition of intelligence itself. This quiet rebellion, fought with knowledge instead of fists, was perhaps the most dangerous threat to the old order yet. You could punish a punch. You could block a political motion. How do you stop an idea? How do you fight understanding? This was a war fought not in the courtyards or council chambers, but in the minds of the students. She was empowering them to challenge the status quo from the inside, using their own intellectual growth as the weapon. The resolution was not a dramatic victory. It was a slow, steady shift. A change in the atmosphere. The classroom, that small borrowed room, had become the new front line. The most important battles were no longer about territory or title. They were about ideas. And on that battlefield, Siri Nathal was proving to be the most formidable general of them all. Real change, it turned out, didn't always start with a revolution. Sometimes it started with a tutor and a willing student, finding a better way forward together. The specialist's report landed on Jonathan's desk. It was a clinical, dense document, but its conclusion was a bomb. Cascade syndrome was not purely a genetic curse. It was a disease of environment. The toxin load in the Eastern District's air and water, the industrial byproducts of the city's glittering core, acted as a trigger. They accelerated the neural degeneration. The implication was a quiet medical condemnation. The elite's systemic neglect of the district wasn't just a social failing. It was a literal, physical poison. It was making its own people sick. Sci-Fi Nathal became the living test case. The treatment Jonathan had funded, once a desperate stopgap, now had a clear target. The specialist prescribed a regimen of targeted neuroregeneratives and, critically, a strict protocol of filtered air and purified water. It was a simple, almost obvious prescription. Remove the poison. Let the body heal. Her improvement was slow, gradual, but it was real. The tremors in her hands lessened. The chronic pain behind her eyes faded. Her color returned. Her small apartment, once a place of quiet despair, began to feel like a place of recovery. This was a quiet victory, a personal one. It stood in stark contrast to the loud, public political battles raging outside her window. While Jonathan and Sophia fought in council chambers, Sifia fought for her life in a small room, and she was winning. Her recovery was a tangible counterpoint. It was proof that change was not just possible. It was already happening, one breath of clean air at a time. Cascade syndrome was recontextualized. It was no longer a death sentence written in her DNA. It was a treatable condition of poverty, a direct result of neglect. The medical truth reframed the entire conversation. This wasn't about curing an alien illness. It was about curing a societal failure. The disease was a symptom. The cause was the district itself. This new understanding became a powerful weapon. It was no longer an abstract argument about equality or potential. It was a matter of public health, a quantifiable medical crisis. Jonathan and Sophia wielded this truth in every debate. How could they argue for maintaining a system that was scientifically proven to inflict a debilitating illness on its own citizens? The data was undeniable. The argument for systemic change and investment was no longer moral. It was medical. It was a matter of survival. The syndrome, this shared affliction, began to bind the two species in a new way. It moved beyond the shared struggle against prejudice. It forged a shared hope for a healthier future. Human medical technology, combined with this new alien understanding of their own biology, created a partnership. They weren't just building bridges of culture. They were building a better, cleaner world for everyone. The fight for health became a common purpose. This resolution transformed a deeply personal tragedy, the loss of Sophia's husband and her own suffering, into the catalyst for something much larger. It became the driving force behind a push for planetary healthcare reform. It forced a conversation about environmental standards, about resource allocation, about the basic right to live in a place that didn't make you ill. A disease born from despair and neglect became a focal point for a shared planetary purpose. The fight for the Eastern District was no longer just about education or equality. It was about the fundamental right to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, to live a life not cut short by the environment you were born into. The Nathal family's pain had revealed a truth that would eventually heal an entire world. The soft, shared glow that pulsed between their hands was more than just a symbol of their bond. It was a tool they didn't yet understand. They first noticed it during a late-night study session, buried in equations for their advanced astrophysics seminar. A complex problem involving multi-dimensional gravity fields had them both stumped for over an hour, the numbers a frustrating blur on their datapads. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. Siri reached over, her fingers lightly brushing his. The familiar resonance shimmered into view, a gentle light under their skin. But something else happened. The chaotic jumble of variables in Michael's mind suddenly snapped into a sharp, crystalline clarity. He saw the path. The flux density, he said, his voice full of sudden certainty. It's not a constant. It's a variable based on localized space-time curvature. Siri's eyes widened. She saw it too, the solution unfolding in her mind as if he had handed it to her. Which means the secondary equation needs a dynamic counterweight, she finished, her hand flying over her datapad. They solved it in under a minute, a problem that should have taken a team of graduate students a week. They sat back, staring at each other, the glow fading from their hands. The silence in the room was thick with a new kind of tension, wonder, and a little fear. Their private connection had just become a tangible, measurable asset. This resonance effect was more than romance. It was a cognitive sync, a merging of minds that let them process information at a terrifying, powerful speed. They kept it to themselves at first, a secret weapon for their studies. But genius that potent is hard to hide. Their academic performance became a statistical anomaly. They aced exams meant to be impossible. Their joint projects were works of staggering complexity, solving theoretical problems academics had debated for decades. Scientists from both species took notice, a human and an alien, working in perfect, inexplicable harmony. Research proposals started landing on Jonathan's desk. Quiet, urgent requests for scans, for tests, for just a few hours of their time to study this unprecedented neural coupling. Their bond was no longer just their own. It was a subject of intense fascination, a key that might unlock a new chapter in xenobiology. It suggested a deeper biological compatibility between their species than anyone had ever dared to dream. It was the ultimate argument against Trelovich's ideology of separation. His entire philosophy was built on the idea that their species were too different, too alien to truly unite. But here was the proof, glowing under their skin. Their very bodies argued for unity. Their cells themselves were rejecting the idea of separation. They found themselves in a strange new world. They were two teenagers in love, trying to navigate the fragile privacy of their relationship, and they were also a living scientific experiment, the most important one on the planet. Every glance, every touch was now watched not just for its affection but for its data. They had to learn to live under that microscope, to protect the quiet truth of their feelings while the whole world saw them as a phenomenon. The resolution of their struggle wasn't a single event. It was a slow acceptance. Their love had not just brought two people together. It had become a force that unlocked a scientific revelation. Their connection was the first faint signal of a deeper truth waiting to be discovered. A biological imperative for connection that reached across the stars. The Eastern District didn't wait to be saved. It saved itself. Watching Siri Nathal walk into that academy, seeing her family rise from the shadows of illness and debt with quiet, fierce dignity, it lit a fuse. The publicity from the wedding bombing scandal didn't just shame Trelovich. It gave the district a spotlight, and for the first time they decided to step into it and speak for themselves. The tension shifted. It moved from a slow, simmering resentment to a sharp, focused energy. They were no longer just victims of prejudice. They became the architects of their own future. The story was no longer about what was being done to them. It was about what they were doing for themselves. Community leaders emerged from the workshops in cramped apartments. Not politicians, mechanics, teachers, engineers who fixed the city's infrastructure with scavenged parts. They didn't go to the Planetary Council with pleas for charity. They went with demands for justice. They carried data chips filled with health metrics, air quality reports, economic projections. Their arguments were not emotional. They were logical, unassailable. They articulated their needs not as a request, but as a bill that was long overdue. They bypassed the broken official channels entirely. They stopped asking for permission to build a better life. If the city wouldn't provide a school, they built their own in a repurposed warehouse using donated datapads and teachers from their own ranks. When the clinics turned them away, they set up their own medical stations, staffed by doctors who understood Cascade Syndrome because they lived with it. They forged their own trade networks with off-world merchants, trading expertly crafted tech and rare minerals from the district's forgotten mines. They built a parallel system, brick by brick, outside the walls that had tried to contain them. The public perception of the Eastern District began to transform. The media narrative, once a litany of crime statistics and poverty, slowly changed. News feeds started showing images of the new community school, of the clean clinic, of the bustling, self-organized market. The district was no longer a place of danger in the public eye. It was a place of determined resilience, a place of fierce, stubborn pride. This grassroots movement became Jonathan and Sophia's most powerful, unexpected ally. It was a force they hadn't created. They had only empowered it with a single act of belief. Now it was a tidal wave they could only hope to guide. The political calculation changed completely. The narrative was no longer about the elite saving the poor. It was about the powerful finally catching up to the people who were already building the future without them. It was about following the district's lead. The resolution of their struggle proved a simple, powerful truth. Dignity is not given. It is taken. Real lasting change does not trickle down from the top. It erupts from within. It is built by the hands of those who need it most. The people of the Eastern District stopped waiting for a hero to write their story. They picked up the pen themselves and started writing. The misunderstood district, for so long a silent character in someone else's narrative, had finally begun to tell its own. The cost of principle arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, chilling silence. For Jonathan Mercer, the solidarity of Earth's diplomatic corps evaporated. Doors that were once always open now clicked shut before he arrived. Conversations in the embassy halls died when he turned the corner. The message was clear. He had broken the first rule of diplomacy: do not get involved. His actions were no longer seen as strategic. They were a personal entanglement, a liability. Official inquiries landed on his desk, cold formal documents demanding he justify his use of resources for what they termed non-standard humanitarian outreach. The whispered accusations followed him. He'd gone native. He'd lost his objectivity. His judgment was clouded by emotional attachment. His wealth, once a shield of privilege, was now a weapon used against him. Colleagues who came from similar backgrounds of influence and money dismissed his efforts as a rich man's hobby. In their eyes, he wasn't fighting for a cause. He was slumming, playing at revolution with his safety net securely in place. They couldn't understand that his money was the only tool he had to fight a system built on it. The criticism aimed to delegitimize everything, to reduce a moral crusade to eccentric pastime. The pressure was a constant grinding weight. Director Harlow became his most vocal critic. "The Aliens respect strength, Mercer, not charity," he'd say, his voice cold across the comm link. "You are showing weakness. You are compromising our position in the Galactic Council negotiations." Jonathan was forced to constantly defend himself. Why was he risking a promising career? Why was he endangering his own son's safety by associating with a controversial family? Why was he gambling Earth's strategic interest for one alien girl? This relentless opposition did not break him. It forged him. The need to answer these charges over and over forced him to refine his resolve. He had to articulate his mission with a clarity and passion he'd never needed before. He wasn't just helping a family. He was championing a fundamental principle. Intelligence and dignity are not privileges of birthright, he argued, his voice gaining certainty with each fight. They exist everywhere. To ignore them isn't just a moral failure. It is a strategic waste of the galaxy's greatest resource. His words became sharper, his convictions harder. The fire of this opposition completed his transformation. The polished diplomat was gone. In his place stood a revolutionary. He was no longer a representative of Earth's political interests. He was a representative of a far simpler, more powerful idea. His integrity was no longer an abstract concept. It was measured in what he was willing to lose for it. His career, his reputation, his standing among his peers. He looked at the cost and made his choice. He would stand with the Nathals. He would stand with the district. He would stand for the principle that a mind is a terrible thing to waste, no matter what world it comes from. He chose a lasting legacy over a comfortable career. The price of that principle was everything he had, and he paid it without hesitation. The educational and cultural corridor came into existence not with fanfare, but with a quiet, determined signing of papers. It was built on the foundation Jonathan and Sophia had risked everything to lay. The program was a structured, official pipeline now. Student exchanges between the district and the elite academies. Merit-based scholarships funded by pooled resources from both governments. Joint research initiatives with labs in both sectors. It was a bridge made of paperwork and promise. The tension of its implementation was a constant, grinding reality. Every step was a negotiation. District parents eyed the program with deep suspicion, fearing it was just another way for the elite to claim their brightest and never return them. Academy administrators dragged their feet on housing allocations and curriculum integration, their bias a silent, stubborn wall. The logistical problems felt endless. Transport schedules, security protocols, cultural sensitivity training for teachers who had never set foot in the Eastern District. The deep-seated mistrust on both sides was the program's biggest obstacle, a ghost in every meeting room. Siri and Michael were the first official enrollees. Their names were on the first line of the first roster. They were living symbols of the corridor's entire purpose. They walked the gleaming halls not as outliers or rebels, but as pioneers. Their presence was a daily, quiet challenge to the old way of thinking. They were the proof of concept. This corridor was more than a program. It was a physical and philosophical challenge to the status quo, made permanent. It declared that the separation between district and elite was not natural law. It was a choice, and now there was a different one available. It was a finger permanently pointing toward a different future. It was imperfect. It was messy. It was constantly criticized. Some said it moved too fast. Others said it didn't move fast enough. Every misstep, every cultural misunderstanding was held up by its opponents as proof the entire idea was flawed. But it existed, and it was growing. A dozen students became 24, then 50. The grants were awarded. The research papers, co-authored by teams from both worlds, began to be published. This was the institutionalization of the change that began on a park bench. Jonathan's single act of seeing one girl was no longer a personal mission. It was a system. It was a sustainable structure designed to outlive him, to outlive all of them. It made the progress permanent. Its most powerful function was its promise of replication. It ensured that the next Siri Nathal would not be overlooked. The next brilliant mind, born in the shadows of the Eastern District, would be found. They would be nurtured. Their talent would be celebrated, not hidden away or left to wither. The system was now looking for them. This resolution turned a powerful personal victory into a lasting systemic solution. The corridor wasn't a finish line. It was a pipeline, a conduit for hope, built to carry the next generation across the divide that had once seemed unbridgeable. It took the singular story of one family and used it to write a new set of rules for everyone. The corridor was built not for Siri or for Michael or for Jonathan. They had already crossed their own bridges. It was built for the ones still waiting in the shadows. It was built for everyone who would come after. It was a door held open, a permanent invitation to a future that was no longer determined by the district you were born in, but by the talent you carried within you. The work was far from over, but the path was now clear and it was open for business. A single glance rewrote the destiny of worlds. This story proves our future isn't built in grand councils but in countless small choices. A man deciding to truly see. A girl choosing to teach. A family accepting an alliance over charity. These small acts of seeing and helping created a current too strong for prejudice to stand against. Their journey from a park bench to a new era shows that a single person is never just a single person. Your actions create ripples. Remember that the next time you think you can't make a difference. Subscribe for more tales of courage and compassion among the stars.